Always so quiet at the beginnings of these things.
It's great. We're having some people come in, so we'll probably take a minute to let that start to fill up, and then I'll introduce the presentation and do a short land acknowledgement. I don't know, Vicky, if you want to extend that land acknowledgement out to LA whenever I finish, but we're in virtual Chicago at least.
Yeah, that's fine. I can do that when I introduce myself. That's fine.
Okay, great. So just want to welcome everybody, and we're going to have time for Q&A after the artists do their presentation and their conversation. So please don't hesitate to, at the same time, don't hesitate to put questions into chat if it's available. We're using Super Zoom, which is super, but I'm less familiar with it than regular Zoom. My name is Tal Foster. I'm the director of the Native American Support Program here at UIC, and we are a co-sponsor of this event. And we wanted to find an event to connect these two indigenous people and Asian American folks in a conversation. And what we decided to do is go ahead and let the artist introduce themselves, but our idea was to have some people on our panel who could really get into that conversation and open up the space, which is fairly unique and maybe a lesser known part of our overall community, part of the community I felt like was important for us to highlight. So in the spirit of healing, I acknowledge and honor the original peoples of the Chicagoland area, the Three Fires Confederacy. I know many of us are joining from the greater Great Lakes, and of course, the Three Fires Confederacy would have been and still is important and significant throughout the Great Lakes, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, as well as other tribal nations that know this area as our ancestral homeland, including the Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Miami, Peoria, and Sac and Fox. Furthermore, I acknowledge that this land, this virtual land for us and many of you are elsewhere, is the current home to one of the largest urban Native American communities in the United States, that is Chicago. Native people are part of Chicago's past, present, and future. And finally, I want to say that to acknowledge is to act. And I encourage anyone who's here with us today to consider the multitude of ways that you can translate your expertise and your knowledge into active support for the indigenous peoples and communities around you and nationally and around the world. Wado. Okay, so I have my good friend Ji-Yoon Lee, who is a Korean American, Korean artist here in Chicago, who is going to kind of run the show a little bit and kind of ask the questions of our panelists. And we'd like for everybody to introduce themselves as well to kind of get it started. So thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you, Tol. 안녕하세요. 제 이름은 이지연입니다. My name is Ji-Yeon Lee. Like Tol said, I'm an artist of Korean descent living in Chicago, and I'm going to serve as moderator, facilitator, provoker, who knows, encourager for the conversation. And I'm very happy to be here and to do this, which may be the first time ever that a conversation of this kind has happened. So I'm very grateful to Deborah Yepapapan for suggesting it and for gathering the people for today's event. So yeah, so I wanted to invite Vicky and Deborah to introduce themselves. It doesn't have to be short, whatever you would like to share about yourself, your work, your background, and then we'll go from there. So as our virtual guest, Vicky, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So yeah, Mitakiapi, Vicky Eagle, Machiapi, Si Changu Oyanke Matahan, Chante Washte Nape Chiusape, Hajime Mashte, Vicky Eagle. I am so my name is Vicky Eagle. I am Si Changu Lakota. I identify as also Japanese. My mother is from Japan, is from Tokushima Karakimashita, meaning she's from Tokushima prefecture area. I'm currently a PhD student at UCLA in anthropology. So right now I'm on Gabriela Notongva land. So I'd like to at least acknowledge virtually where I am at. I am a photographer and I do beading for fun on the side, but I would say like in terms of my artwork, I would identify more as a photographer, and excited to be here to kind of talk about our topics today. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Great. Thanks for being part of this. Deborah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm liking all these people that are coming in. This number is huge. Thank you all for joining us today. And first, I want to thank Gian for reaching out and saying, "Hey, you want to do this thing with me?" So yeah, I'm so excited. So thank you, Gian, for this invitation. Thank you to the Asian American Resource and Cultural Center and the Native American Support Program at University of Illinois at Chicago for hosting this conversation. I'm Deborah Yepo Papan. I'm Jemez Pueblo and Korean. I'm also a mother, wife, daughter, visual artist, Chicagoan. I'm the Native Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Field Museum. I'm at work right now. This is my lunch break, so it's okay. I'm also a co-founder of the Center for Native Futures, which is a new Native arts organization that I co-founded with my husband, artist Chris Papan, and a small collective of Chicago-based Native American contemporary artists. And so we created our space because, Chicago just does not have, there's nobody here that represents us or, makes space for us as artists. So we had to take that agency to do it on our own. I'm also a board member of Illinois Humanities, and I was recently appointed to the Cultural Advisory Council for the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events here in the city of Chicago. So I'm trying my best to represent Native people and Native artists in the best way possible here in the city of Chicago, which is a long time coming. So yeah, I'm excited for our conversations today.
So basically what the two of you said is that you're both busy women. So involved in a lot of things and making a lot of good things happen in the world. So thank you for making time to be part of this conversation today. I wanted to start with if you'd like to tell us a bit of your story about what got you to the work that you're doing today. And in some ways, I want to start with the work that you're doing, not necessarily about who you are, because I don't want who you are to be something that is exoticized or made to seem like something that is a curiosity or a spectacle. So, but the work that you've each chosen to do, all the different facets of it, is about you and your decisions. And so I'd be curious to hear from each of you a little bit about your path to this work, to the work that you're doing in your life now. So yeah, I don't know who would like to start.
Vicky.
All right. Back.
Yeah, since we're on a panel, there's like a lot of folks here. I know looking at Zoom boxes, if you don't mind, I will actually show my PowerPoint, at least do something, give some visuals. It helps me at least like narrate because I can like go on forever. So yeah, to kind of talk about who I am, that's a really big question, and how I came to where I'm at is like a really big thing, I would say. I do presentations. So I've done presentations for some of the mixed race panels at UCLA. And just like in general, just like different identity conversations. I think that's kind of how I fell into anthropology, as I love culture. And I love understanding how culture influences everyday life. And being a Japanese and Lakota person who like really grew up in the city area. I kind of always say I have like three facet identities where, I'm Japanese. I'm the first in my family to be born in the United States on my mother's side, but I'm Indigenous, right, at the same time to this place where I'm the part of the first peoples, right, that are from here. So having this like identity, I think, of being first in different ways, and understanding this world both through immigrant like eyes, through my mother. My mother like came to the United States when she was 27 years old. She did not speak English fluently, so I learned at a young age to read really quickly, so I could like help my mother with forms, to help her kind of navigate just even this system and just not understanding it at all. At the same time, I grew up with my grandfather who would come visit through Denver multiple times. Like my family was really close to me in the Denver area. I wasn't very much like separated in that sense. My grandfather's a fluent Lakota speaker and someone who could pray in the language, and something that I saw growing up that I really admired, but didn't always have access, I think, to that language in particular. So I think for me, I always like have this like different hats is kind of what it feels like at times, of like who I am and how I identify. So I think that's why photography became kind of my outlet, became this place to like understand like how to experiment like with understanding my identities. And I think like even photography, like if anyone wants to like ever find themselves to be represented in their own artwork, really we have to create it and we have to be the ones to make it, because we can't wait for someone to create what we see and imagine in this world. And I think that's why for me, photography was, well, what is it like to be me? What is it like to be in this bicultural thing and to really be connected to both? And to, I don't know, yeah, like to be okay with being both, right? And to like never, and to just fully embrace that. And I think that's like how I kind of came into photography, as like, okay, well, I understand I'm Japanese, I'm Lakota. I was born in the Black Hills, so this is in Lakota country, in South Dakota, born in the homelands in that way of the Lakota peoples, of like where we see the heart of where everything is. And, for me, my connection to this place is really significant to me, where I get to see the world both from the Northern Plains and then also in Japan. So to the left is a photo of my grandparents. This is actually their wedding photograph. They're actually not in a traditional like Japanese wedding attire, because this was during World War II. It was considered a really hard time for the Japanese people, like economically, warfare, etc., that it was not really seen as a time to celebrate wedding, but to still do the ceremony. So this is my like grandparents. And then to the right is my great grandparents, which is my grandfather's parents. And kind of like, how do I get to look at these photographs of my family and kind of bring them in conversation together? And that's kind of like just been my journey, was just starting to look at the photographs that I have, looking at my family photographs, looking at my mother. So this is my mother. To the right is when she was 17 years old at Mount Fuji on a high school trip. And then to the left is us coming here to Denver, where I call home, when I was around 4 years old. This is kind of where my life really started. Yeah, just like growing up in the city, leaving South Dakota, starting a whole new life with my mother, and just like having this adventure, what I call my life. But I take photographs where I come and visit, like where my grandfather lived on the reservation, who grew up in, well, he kind of ended up retiring the Cheyenne River, but he grew up in yeah, on the Rosebud Reservation, but kind of retired in Cheyenne River. So I got to like kind of just visit these different places and kind of like, I would say like, how do you make photographs, right? And how do you make images that represent your life and your daily things? So, you know, as a Japanese person growing up with Miyazaki, I've never seen these films like in English until like I was like in middle school. So I grew up with them in Japanese. And yeah, I just like recommend self-portraiture as a way to like understand yourself or understand like how you connect to sense of yourself, place, where you're at, and then how all your identities kind of like come together. So I'll just leave it at that for right now. I don't want to take up too much time explaining. But yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you. Let me stop share screen.
Great. Thank you. That was so great. Yeah, I do encourage both of you to take up a lot of space and a lot of time.
I know. I was gonna say, Vicky, just keep going. Because I really enjoyed that. This is the first, so I'm learning a lot about Vicky here too. And I mean, just so much of what you're saying just really resonates with me and my own you know, personal experience as well. I think you know, coming from two different cultures that are both very diverse from each other, but in so many ways, you know, there's so many similarities. You know, and to be mixed race, you know, I think you know, we also have our experiences as Native people living here, you know, on our homelands, but we also have immigrant experiences. We also know what it means to be an immigrant. And so I guess I'll seg into my story really quickly, and I'll share my screen as well. And I think for me, it's a little difficult for me to start, you know, just with my work. I mean, I kind of do have to, you know, I always use my own origin story and my background to kind of seg into, you know, the work that I create. And much like Vicky, you know, a lot of my work is about, you know, my own identity and, you know, who I am and sharing that with the world. But I was born in Korea. So, you know, this is my family on my mother's side. And, you know, it's funny how people are always like, well, how did your parents meet? My dad was in the army. And so like, you know, like many, you know, in many ways, you know, people would meet when somebody is stationed, you know, in another country. So my dad was stationed in Korea where he met my mother. And so, you know, I was born in Korea. And my dad, you know, was sent back to the States to, you know, to serve here. And, you know, after I was born, my mother wanted me to, you know, grow up with my father. She wanted us to all be together. You know, I think it was also just knowing just how difficult it would be for me to be mixed race and growing up, you know, in Korea, and also being, you know, a child of, you know, a military person. So, you know, she knew that would be very challenging. And so she wanted to make sure that we were all together and that I would have that opportunity to grow up here knowing who my father is. And so when I was 5 months old, we emigrated to the States, and we, you know, this is on Christmas Eve when we were leaving Korea. And my mother, you know, she was maybe 21 or so at this time, and her English was very, very limited. And she had a newborn baby, and I can't imagine what that was like for her to, you know, to leave her home country, to leave her family. She was the oldest girl in her family of, I think she had 8 or 9 siblings. And so for her to do this, you know, I mean, just the tremendous amount of courage that had to have taken for her to come here. And so one of the first places, you know, we came into California, where we met my father's sister, my aunt, and then we came to Jemez Pueblo, which is, my father's homeland, my ancestral homelands on his side in New Mexico. So Jemez is about 40 miles north of Albuquerque. And this is what it looks like there. It still looks like this, looked like this hundreds of years ago, and it still looks like this today. And so here, my mother is holding me on her back, and she's with my grandmother, my father's mother, and his aunt, my great aunt. So this was her first exposure to, any culture in America. And so, what I like to say about my mom is that she assimilated into Jemez culture and never really assimilated into, the American culture. And then, we moved to Chicago when I was about 1.5. So I grew up here. This is my hometown. But my parents made sure to keep us connected. My mom, especially, was just it meant so much for her to make sure that I knew, my father's side, and that I was Jemez and Native American, and that we maintained those really strong connections to home. But, I never had the chance to learn either language. So, for both my parents, English is their second language. My father grew up speaking Jemez, and my mother, of course, she spoke Korean. But the common language in our home was English. And so I never really had the opportunity to learn either of the languages, because the only way that we could all communicate together was in English. And I also went to English classes with my mother, because, she was working, and then she also, she wanted to better her English speaking. And so without, she didn't have daycare, we didn't have family support. It was just the three of us here in Chicago. I had to go with her to, these night classes where she would learn English with other immigrants. So I'm, like 3 and 4 years old, sitting next to her, learning English alongside. So, that was my experience. And I know, a lot of times too, like with other mixed race families, and I just remember as a child, a lot of other mixed race families, parents would often, just separate or divorce because they just, their differences were so great that they would never be able to find that balance or that way to embrace each other. But, my parents stayed together. My mom, through hard times, through through rough times, she stayed with my dad, and I think they both just really, really embraced each other and each other's cultures, and they were very open and proud of that, and they really instilled that in me. And I think that I feel like I have really strong roots in both because of them. And, I often get asked too from people, well, which side do you identify most with? And, for me, I can't say that I identify more with one than the other. It's like asking me, who do you love more, your mother or your father? And I love them both, very, very much equally. And so, to this day, and right now, especially, I'm proud to say I'm 100% Korean. I'm 100% Jemez Pueblo. And, so that's my experience growing up. That's my experience, and also having, urban influences growing up in Chicago, but always there's always this having to prove, right? Prove who I am, prove that I am, Native American. What does that look like? What does that mean? Because, there's so many stereotypes that people have of Native people. And so, what better way to express that than through art, and creating images that talk about who I am, and showing people who I am. But I'm going to stop here, and then I think we'll share our artworks later.
both of your stories are so rich. I like what it seems that a lot of what's brought you to the work that you do now is using art as a vehicle for showing who you are in a world that doesn't understand necessarily who you are. And both of you talked a little bit too about the strengths of coming from the backgrounds that you have. And Deborah, you started talking about this a little bit in terms of the stereotypes and misconceptions that people throw at you. And maybe we can talk just a little bit about that before we talk more about your work too, because I imagine there's a piece of your work that may be in response to some of that. In some panels that I've been part of or witnessed, where people are trying to learn how to be allies, one of the questions that I've heard people respond to is, what's something that you don't want other people to do or say, or just do or say again, ever. So if you're going to answer that, how would you respond?
Vicky?
I know, I'm like, that's a really big question. Yeah, I actually do have like kind of the artwork piece to it that I could transition into talking about.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
These are just launching points for you to really just talk about anything you want to talk about.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Okay, yeah, let me share my
Yeah.
screen again.
Yeah.
So kind of where I left off last time. Yeah, I think, something I think about like that really, I think really formulated like who I am and the work that I've done. So I've been in student affairs for a really long time too. Prior to my PhD, I spent like 6 years in student affairs, I want to say, cumulative, working as I was a former director actually of the Native American community partnerships and programs at the University of Denver. That's where I did my undergraduate degree. That's where I did my master's as well in higher education. So something that I was always really passionate about, I think, is like the student affairs experience too. And the reality of, I think, the representation of Native students that are on campus and how that's reflected, I think, in the experiences of being a Native American person in general, especially in like, the University of Denver, when I went, it was like a 92% like white institution, predominantly white, private, elite university. And that was something I was not used to. Like, I know like Colorado and Denver, it's like white, but like the different kind of like class white it's like in these like private white elite institutions, an experience I was just not familiar with at all, especially class wise. And I think that was kind of the launching point of my photography, I think, is this, if we were to think how to be an ally, I really think it's this like invisibilization and like the need for other groups of people, like of any, race, ethnicity, etc., to actually just like come help elevate, I think, that voice. And as the original Native peoples like of the land, always gets kind of often dismissed in education, at least in like my experiences in student affairs. It's always like, oh, well, there's not that many of you. What support services do you need? Like, why do we need a full-time employee if there's only X amount? And it's like, well, that's exactly why you need like student affairs professionals. Is because that's the issue, right? Is that you don't feel we're represented on our campus or within these institutional spaces. So I created this project at the time called Real Life Indian, just as a satire. I know a lot of people would email me saying they actually didn't like the term Indian, and people who felt like Indian was a problematic term. And that they wanted instead, like, we're not from India, you shouldn't use Indian. And I was like, yeah, that's actually part of why I did it as this satire piece of like, let's call it Real Life Indian, where there's just a bunch of us living like a real life, because most people don't imagine us doing that. And then talk about like, I think the problematic nature of Indian, but then I kind of bring up like, if you look at the history of Native peoples, right, and everything that's signed by treaties is signed under Indian. So it's like Indian Removal Act, Indian Relocation Act, Indian Education, Indian Health Services. So my question is, who are these Indians that sign these treaties, right? So that's kind of where my project launched and departed from, was this idea of like, okay, well, who are these Indians they're talking about? And if we were removed, relocated, put into like these education systems, who's that generation now? And that's kind of like what I wanted to do, to kind of, at least as a launching point, like kind of discuss that. So what I did on my campus, because I felt really isolated, alienated, in multiple ways, right? So being biracial, being a Native person on campus, and just trying to find ways where I could find myself in the university, right? And so instead, what I did was I just like found places in Denver where I could find more home spaces outside of the university, and kind of think about what all these urban spaces, geographic things mean, and where most people have told me they've never met a Native American before. And that was something I wasn't used to. Yeah, just growing in more of a diverse area. Like I couldn't relate to people, so they've never met a Native before. And they grew up in Colorado or grew up in Denver, and it's like you have all these street names named after tribes, and they just had no idea like what these things were. And no idea that they, we host one of the largest powwows right in the center of Denver, March Powwow. I like to really go around, take photographs of community members just doing things that most people don't think we would do, but just really kind of break, I think, that image of what they think like Native people should and shouldn't be. So I started a project just photographing the Native students at my university, because like people don't imagine us often as scholars. Our graduation rates, especially with like, if you look at some of the statistics, they're always showing we have low like graduation attainment and kind of like really deficit numbers in that way. And that always bugged me, because there are people that are graduating, and I feel like we need to talk about that, or talk about what are these systems that are failing our communities or that are doing well for our communities, and how to talk about, I think, like that journey. This one's one of the most significant photographs I'll be talking about later, I think, when I go to talk more about my current work and kind of like the work that I am doing. And it's mainly because like she's wearing a heavy metal t-shirt, and I'll be like coming back to that a little bit later with my work. But yeah, just took photographs of like students that were on my campus, talked to them about their stories, talked to them about what it was like being a Native student. At DU, when I worked at UCLA, I kind of continued that project, looking at Native students on campus, how to represent them within their portraits, within like the work that they do, within their own stories of like where they found success and happiness within these like places and these institutions. And also just like doing cubicle series of just like, do people imagine us working in a cubicle like everybody else in the 9-to-5 life and the grind? I think most people want to imagine, maybe imagine Native people in like, their nature shot in regalia. But the reason I pick like white or black backdrops are really solid one is to kind of, not to say take away the relationship to land, right? Because I know that is important, but just so that people sit with the person and have no other choice but to only look at a human being, and to be like, this is what a Native person looks like. This is like, they could have short hair, they could have long hair, they could have Hello Kitty beadwork, which I love. To see that cross-cultural like connection of like where our Native communities love Asian things as well, and to be like, okay, they also like things I like, and kind of like bring that together. So that's kind of like where I started my portraiture series. And something I talk about like also to help with advocating, I think it's a lot of like, even at the UCLA hospital, I was explaining my ethnic background, and like even an Asian American like woman who I like picked hoping to like understand like who I was, like called my background exotic. And that's something that happens in LA quite often, which I don't like. Is this like, I think I've been called exotic multiple times, I think, out here, of just like, that's a really interesting background, like you're Native American and Japanese. But like yeah, that would be something I would definitely talk about. So something I like spent time like going into therapy for, working on mental health, is At least in both of my cultures, and this is just speaking from my personal experiences, like being an Asian American and also just being Japanese, we don't, and also Native, we don't really talk about mental health. We don't talk about how to access mental health, at least for me growing up. I think we're doing better at it now, but not like when I was growing up. And that was something to, how do I talk about my mental health, my physical health? And like a lot of the times the doctors will ask you like, what runs in your family? And there's a lot of things that run in my family on both sides, and especially on, yeah, just even just like our health disparities in our communities are not talked about. So it's like, that's a really long list. And I think sometimes what's really important, I think, for at least advocating is to understand that as biracial people, I might experience both things at once, right? Or forms of different experiences where I can relate to how like the model minority really is internalized for me and my wanting to be successful, or just this pressure I feel to do that. At the same time, I can also really feel a deep sense, right, of historical trauma and like learning about like my Native peoples and where we're at. And I've taught on the reservation. I was a bus driver before, like I've also been on the grounds in community work, right, like in the front lines, like trying to make things like better for our people and better experiences in student affairs as well. So to kind of understand that there might be multiple things that might also affect, I think, like how I like navigate and where my moods are.
Thank you. I bet, Deborah, you got a lot to say.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, it's and I'm not trying to say that one of the things that we're always countering to is that, as Native people, we're not a monolith, right? I don't know why that's something so hard to get across, because, we do the same with like, I guess, Asian cultures can be perceived as a monolith too. And we all know very well that, Asian cultures are not, right? But again, just, listening to Vicky speak, we both are, our experiences are so similar as mixed race Asian Native people. And, I think what we're both trying to do with our artwork is very similar as well in, challenging and addressing what that is that people think we should be because we're Native or because we're Asian. And so, I'm always asking for people to become good accomplices and not just good allies. And, what does that mean to be a good accomplice? I don't know. I don't always have the answer for that. Sometimes I think I do, and sometimes I don't. But I think, for people, one of the biggest steps and one of the first things that people should do is just listen. Listen to us. Listen to us when we share our stories, when we share our experiences. Listen to us when we're trying. I mean, I feel as Native people, we're always having to educate people about us and about who we are and what it means to be us and to not misrepresent our cultures. And so listening is a huge thing, and don't do anything without us. So there, my friends and I, we have the saying, nothing about us without us, always have us at the table, make space for us, make room for us, and then step aside. And let us lead and follow our lead. But the reason I have this image up right now is, this is here at the Field Museum, or was here at the Field Museum. These are, some of the Native displays that were on exhibit for nearly 70 years. These were first installed in the 50s, early 50s. And just recently, as 3 years ago, were completely deinstalled. And I feel like, the Field Museum and other natural history museums that have Native American collections have always welcomed so many people, thousands of people over time and from, all over the world to come in and see their collections. And then they're exposed to, this imagery, which, yes, like this may be more representative of Vicky's, Native cultural heritage or closer to, but not mine, not as a Pueblo person. This is nowhere near, how my ancestors dressed or, made clothing or, our ceremonies are so completely different. Yet this is the image that people always gravitate to. When we say, or when I've said, yes, I'm Native American, then people are always looking then for those features. They're always looking for, oh yes, I see your high cheekbones. And I'm like, okay. And so then they start to look for these images that they think that I'm supposed to have as a Native person. And then, they fake do this like powwow dance around me while they're going, oh, I like that, which is just completely gross. And so, I've always had to counter that because people are not familiar with who Pueblo people are. Even to this day, this past weekend, I was, at Expo Chicago, and this woman came up to me and she asked me where I was from. I told her I'm Hamis Pueblo in Korean. And she said, oh, I understood Pueblo, but what was that first thing you said? And I said, Hamis. And she said, oh, is that a new name? I've never heard that before. And I was like, listen, lady, my people have been around for thousands and thousands of years, and that's what we've always called ourselves. That is nothing new. But that is the kind of ignorance that we are still, encountered by today, to this very day. And it doesn't just come from, white Americans. It comes from anyone else, who's non-white and non-native in this country that have watched Hollywood movies about cowboys and Indians, that have come to the Field Museum and have seen this type of display. This is the kind of image that people always gravitate to. And so that led to this series for me to create. I took Edward S. Curtis photographs and, manipulated them and collaged them to create these, these are the different stereotypes that I was countering, but using images of, and photographs, again, what best way to represent ourselves, but then rather than to use photographs of people that are close to me, myself, my family, my husband, my father, and putting us in these, images of what people think that we're supposed to look like. And then, also just addressing, blood quantum too, right? So as Native people, I think we're the only people in the world that have to, show and prove who we are by showing how much we are. So how much blood do we have to show that we're Native? So, I have my certificate of Indian blood that shows I'm 50%. Who else has to do that? So it's challenging this, and it's those kinds of things that are imposed on you from the time that you're born. They have a bearing on you and how you feel about yourself and how you feel, what your place is, in the world, right? And so that's what I'm trying to challenge here, are these types of practices, and, whether, am I half empty or half full? And as you heard me earlier, I'm 100% both. And, that's something that I really try to encourage other mixed race, Native people to embrace all those cultures that make you who you are, and not just mixed race Natives, but mixed race people, right? Let's just embrace who we are. These are the other, kinds of things that I had to grow up with. Just the different names that, I was being called, and again, just how wonderful having the full gamut of, all these stereotypical and derogatory names, that people directed at me as I was a child. And that's, that's just such a horrible thing to do. And then, as this one too, again, yeah, like Vicky was saying earlier too, as Native people, we have to, why is it that we always have to prove that we're human beings, that we have to prove that we are just as much a part of society today as everybody else is? And, we want to show, we always have to show that, we are participants in today's culture as well. We are participants in today's pop culture. We all love, Hello Kitty, right? And Star Trek and Doctor Who. And so I created this series too, to just kind of show that we are active participants, today, that we very much like the same things that other people like as well. But we, for many of us, we're still very, closely connected to our cultures and our identities and, what makes us who we are. But then we're also looking to the future, right? We're also using our past to inform our present, to move us into the future, and not only imagining our future, but we're actively creating what our futures can be and should be. I don't know, I feel like I went off on a tangent, but again, I think that's what I use photography for also. I mean, I don't consider myself a photographer, but I use photography as my medium to create my work. And, putting us in, like showing us as human beings, showing us as who we are, as Native people today, I think is something that's so important. And I hate the term that people use sometimes that, Natives are invisible. When we're in these big urban areas, that Natives become invisible. We are not invisible. You can see us as clear as day right now. Both Vicky and I are right here. It's just that people refuse to see us, or they don't know how to see us. And that's what maybe people need to learn, is learn how to see us, learn to just, learn that we are here and that we are everywhere and that we are among you, and learn how to see us, learn who we are, get to know us. So I'll leave it there.
Oh no, I wanted to see the rest of the photos.
I want to volley it over to Vicky.
Oh, Vicky, do you have anything you want to respond with, or do you want to go ahead and tell us more about the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Deborah. Yeah, I love that you're like bouncing off like all my like everything I want to say. It's great. Our experiences are so similar, so it's also really fun to take this time to like, yeah, just like share this space, talk about things that are very similar. And at times it feels kind of alone because you're like, I think I'm the only one that's experiencing the world like this. And it's like really refreshing to see someone like Deborah in the next state over. Like that's like, this is how I feel. And it's like really great because it just doesn't make you feel like you're alone in that way. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think so. The next part of my presentation that I kind of look for is, let's see, I'm gonna go back to share screen. I think this idea of the allyship, right? And I think so kind of going back through my mental health, right? And like me accessing mental health, and kind of what these photographs did for me was I was trying to show like, on the outside, I look fine, maybe, but then the inside, I feel this is like how I feel, right? Where I'm just all over the place, blurry, not sure where to get help, not sure how to navigate these things. So I kind of describe myself in that way as like the Mad Hatter in some ways. So that's kind of like what this photograph was kind of like meant for me, at least. And during the pandemic, right, like there was a lot of things that were happening, I think to kind of really like that triggered, right, my mental health too, right? I mean, this pandemic, that was really, there was a lot going on, and there was just so much happening to both the Asian and Native communities that I felt like we weren't kind of talking together in that way. So I created this project that I called the Asian Natives. And I wish, I know Jamie Okuma wasn't able to make it, but I do want to give her a big shout out to her clothing, to her designs, to her fashion work. And the reason why I chose it is because I know that she's also both identifies as Okinawan, like from just Asian Native in general too. So wanted to give her at least a shout out to this photography. So luckily in Denver, there are a few of us that are Asian Native, and that, you know, we kind of found each other and talked about our experiences. And even just knowing that they were Native in the community, I never knew they were Asian until we actually get to meet and talk about it and like share our experiences and find this common ground. So during, you know, the pandemic, I was really overwhelmed by so many things, right? So how Native people were, just the experiences on communities with COVID were devastating, especially like on Navajo Nation within the New Mexico region, just even to our local community members. It was just a lot to process. And then the amount of anti-Asian hate that was also happening at the same time, and feeling like my mother wasn't safe, at the same time feeling like my communities weren't safe. And that was a lot to process. And especially for like my mother, she told me like she went to the grocery store and people were giving her like extra distance, like extra 6 feet, or they looked at her in certain ways. And she's like, I've lived in this neighborhood for like 7 years and people are looking at me weird in the grocery stores, or they're standing 10 feet away from me, or you know, part of her felt somewhat safe wearing the mask and sunglasses, so they couldn't tell like what she looked like. And I was like, why does that make you feel safe? Like that shouldn't make you feel safe in that sense, but it did, right? And just to hear her experience of like, I've never been looked at weird, it was like she was also coming to this realization. And then when the Atlanta shooting happened, it's almost about a year ago actually, that happened, then I just cried in front of the TV, because I was just like not okay at that point to see what was happening to both the communities that I was that I'm part of, you know, to see these things happening, to see yeah, just even the movement for MMIW is still going on, something to see that, you know, as being an Asian woman and seeing how we were talked about on TV, and like how these people were known as having a bad day, and kind of like wanting to put all that together in conversation. So when I put this out, I was kind of looking at, you know, COVID. I was looking at the hate crimes that were happening, how 3,800 were reported, but that doesn't count unreported. And I just wondered like why we weren't having, or not wondering why, but just like, how do I put these in conversation, I should say, like, how can we talk about this intersectional time in this moment that's happening? And especially how I was experiencing it, this was just what I was seeing. So that was kind of like where I started this project, where I asked my two friends, they're sisters, they're Vietnamese, they're also Sichangu, Lakota, and Navajo, and to talk about like what it meant for them to be like an Asian Native, and what it meant to be during this time, and what it meant for our identities, and what it meant to be kind of living in this moment. So it's a very anthropology thing, as we really want to understand what everyday life is and how we understand it and how we navigate that. So I kind of spent this time with them, talked about their stories, talked about how they were just experiencing what was happening. And I think it became a lot of reflection at the time, to just really think about themselves, who they were, where their families came from, where their legacy came from, and where they are today. And then to try to make sense of these spaces. So that's kind of where I started like this project. And I really like learned a lot. And that we saw a lot of similar patterns come up, like this idea of being exotic, of being hypersexualized, of being having to feel like you had to prove yourself to both of your communities. Like, are you Japanese enough? Or are you Asian enough? Or are you Lakota enough? And having to like fit in this like urban enough, right? And then you have like the reservation, like res politics as well. It's like, oh, are you even res enough? And it's like, there's just so many things that happen at the same time. And it was like a really like great space, I felt like, for us to just like also like one rant, but also just like feel like we could relate to each other at the same time. To kind of talk about what it means, I guess, for me as hafu, right? It's a term that's used a lot in Japanese culture to say you're half Japanese, like, oh, you're hafu. And this is a term that they would use it for me a lot when I was study abroad in Japan. It's like, oh yeah, you're half, right? And Japanese people, it's really common, right? Like this term, right? And it can be very derogatory at times. It can be very belittling at times. But for me, I wanted to reclaim this idea of half, right? About this like idea of like hafu, right? It doesn't mean that it means that you're half a person or half a quantum. I mean, I don't think it has to be seen as a negative way. And this is for me, right? Like I'm still a complete human being. I'm still Japanese. I'm still all these things. And I do think we need to push against these blood quantum politics, absolutely. But for me, you know, hafu for me has been a beautiful reality for me, is the ability that I got to see both worlds right together. And, you know, growing up or going to Japan, studying abroad, living with my host family, I realized there's a lot of things that I didn't grow up with. Not to say that makes me less Japanese, but there's a lot of things that they haven't seen through my life either in the United States that I also think it's really great to own and open to that, to say like, you know, I got to see different things in my life and have a different worldview and get best and sometimes the worst at times, we think, of both worlds. And yeah, and even like, you know, my mother would call me hafu at times, right? But that you just understand your world in their own way and combine it or make sense of it on your own. But I always think it doesn't have to be a bad thing, or a way to find a way to reclaim, I think, that term that makes sense for us too. Yeah, so that's kind of like where I sit with that term. And then, yeah, just coming together, I think, to talk about these spaces, that was kind of our common thread, is that, you know, we felt like we could, you know, our worldview doesn't hinder us, make us less or more, but it just has us see and approach things differently, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. And that's kind of like what I got out of my project for the most part. Yeah, just to share that.
You had said MMIW, and I just want to make sure. Yeah, and I don't know if everybody knows what that refers to.
Yeah, so MMIW is the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women. So that's a movement that is looking to address all of the missing murdered Indigenous women that are never reported on media.
Yeah, thank you. Deborah, how about you? Do you want to talk more about where you're at with your work these days, and anything you want to say?
Yeah, you know, and I want to, you know, relate to what Vicky was saying about, you know, for the longest time, you know, I am actually one of very, very few Hamas Korean people. But I mean, really, it was like my whole childhood into like young adulthood where I thought I was the only Asian Native person like ever. Because I had never met anyone else that was, you know, both Asian and both Native, until I met Louis Gong, who is Chinese and Nooksack from Seattle. And so he was the first person that I met who, you know, was both Asian and Native. And then I started meeting, you know, more people afterwards, but it's still, you know, I think we have just such a unique identity. And you know, I've always felt that way, you know, and there aren't very, very many of us. And so, yeah, so that, you know, so you're the only Native in the room, that's lonely. But then you're the only Native Asian in the room, that gets lonelier, right? Because then you don't have a lot of people that can relate or that know, you know, what that means, and they don't understand that experience. They don't understand the, you know, that I have both, you know, Native, because, you know, I've visited my family on the res a lot, so I know what it's like. You know, even though I didn't grow up on the res, or I don't live there, I understand what, you know, what it's like to be on the res, to come from the res. I live in an urban area, so I have those experiences. And then I also have immigrant experiences, you know, going to English classes with my mother as she was trying to learn English, and then having, you know, people, you know, I think she's always experienced hate though, right? It's just been exacerbated because of the pandemic. And I've always been scared for her, because when she first came to the United States, you know, she had a newborn baby. She was in the airport and she needed to feed me. So she was breastfeeding me in public. And at that time in the 70s, nobody breastfed their baby in public. But for her, it was natural because that's what she did back home, right? And so, she had people spit at her and tell her like that's disgusting, or say whatever to her, and she didn't understand because her English was very limited, but she just knew that people just didn't like what she was doing. And so she had always experienced some kind of hatred and some kind of anti-Asian sentiment. She had been told many times in her life, why don't you go back to your own country? Many times. And so she would share that with me, right? But then she would always like kind of jump back at those folks and be like, you go back. My husband's Native American, my daughter's Native American. You're the one that doesn't belong here. So I was always so proud of her, for being able to stand up. And I think that's why it's those experiences that she had, that she wanted to make sure that I knew, that she wanted me to be proud, to be Native, because of just those awful experiences. And especially like in the last couple years, she would watch the news and she would hear about, Asians being attacked just for being Asian, because of our stupid former president. And she would be scared, though, she just like, there wasn't really anything that happened in the city of Chicago, or at least nothing major that I've heard of, but she was always still scared, but she always holds her head up high. It's a hard thing to, I think it becomes a normal part of our lives, right? That we have to deal with and know how to navigate through all of that. And being mixed race, being familiar with both of our cultures, but then being familiar with like you said, Vicky, like being familiar with the res, being familiar with the urban areas, like we just have so much that we go in and out of, like sometimes I feel like we can be chameleon, right? Like we have that, we have that ability to just cope with and deal with. And go in and out and put ourselves and make ourselves a part of whatever situation we're in. It's that adaptability, right? And I think a lot of Native people, especially, we've had to be adaptable. We've had to deal with adversity. We had to deal with these are all survival skills. And it gets to the point where we're dealing with it all the time and so much that it's just a natural thing for us to know how to navigate. Anyway, I just wanted to share that because that was all going through my head as you were talking, Vicky. But just, I'm just going to go into my work a little bit and just sharing just, what I try to raise my daughter with. I want her to know, where she's from and who she is. And, it's so important for me that she knows that she's Jemez Pueblo. And this is how we are as Pueblo people. She dances in our feast day ceremonies, and I make sure that we take her back home so that she is well connected to our community there. And hopefully someday I can take her back to Korea. She's never been there, and that's where I was born. So I would love to take her back there as well, so she maintains that connection. But then she's also Kanza and Osage and Cheyenne River Lakota on her father's side, and also mixed race European or mixed European background on her grandmother's side, on her dad's side. So she's got all of these cultures, and yeah, like it's difficult to embrace all of them, right? And I think she really gravitates toward, she hangs out. She has a lot of Asian friends. She helped to found an Asian sorority, at her college. She's at Western Michigan University, though they're opening that up to include, they want to be more inclusive and include more people, you know, from other cultural backgrounds as well. And so that, you know, that's the work that she's doing. But, you know, in showing and wanting her to be proud of who she is, you know, I've given her a Korean name. Her name is Jihye. And, you know, I always want to make sure that she knows, you know, what her backgrounds are and how rich they are. And so I try to do that through my artwork. You know, I'm a proud mom. I'm so proud of her. And, you know, I want to show her in her traditional, you know, dance ceremonial clothing. But, you know, sometimes I incorporate Asian imagery or Korean imagery to show that that is also who we are. And this is how our cultures come together. So these are just a few of those images. And then, you know, also making sure that, you know, we're so connected to Chicago. Chicago is so much a part of who we are and what makes us who we are, that, you know, these are my L series or my home pieces. These are very much about home. And for a lot of Native people, home is, you know, two places. It's the area that we're living in. So Chicago's my home. But then when you hear me saying I'm going home, means I'm going to Jemez Pueblo, where my dad's side of the family is from. That's home also. And so the title There and Back Again is always that going back and forth, that going home and coming back home. And, you know, and it works both ways for so many Native people. And I think that's something that people need to, you know, understand about Native people too, is just, you know, it's not just, you know, these multiple cultures that make us who we are, but it's also these environments that we're a part of that make us who we are as well. And then just, I'll share this lastly. This is Jihye, as she's still carrying on this tradition of, you know, dancing and going back home and participating in our ceremonies. And I think, you know, this is it's truly an example of many Native cultures being matrilineal, and how, you know, she's enrolled in Jemez, so she's a tribal member with Jemez Pueblo, but she follows our Pueblo tradition much more than she follows, you know, her father's, you know, tradition. But you know, for me, growing up in the United States, it was easier for me to, and necessary for me to carry on the traditions of my father, and our Jemez Pueblo side, because it's so important for Native cultures to continue and to thrive. I think, you know, I think Koreans are all right. They're doing okay. So I'll leave it there.
Well, we're starting to get a few questions and I do want to ask them. But before that, Vicky, you were going to say more about heavy metal, and I think it's time to hear about that.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll make this one really quick. Give me 1 second here. I'm always like pulling up my PowerPoint and to do the share screen. Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah, for sharing that, and all your photographs. They're so beautiful. Like, I think photographs are a great way of like remapping and doing stories and just like how to reclaim our space and understand, like, I guess, how we understand the world. And I just think it's such a great window to kind of see all those things. So yeah, I've really enjoyed looking at photographs. I can look at photographs like all day. So yeah, pretty much like what I have done, I guess, like in terms of identities, right? So I always say, you know, I'm Japanese, I'm Lakota, right? And then I know I have like a student affairs hat sometimes, I'm a current student, but then I also find like subcultures. So that's why I love the metal scene, or I love rock scenes, because this is something in high school I really gravitated towards, because there was no space for being Asian Native. And sometimes there wasn't a lot of space for being, especially like in the 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't a lot of, especially like Bush era times, like there was not a lot of cultural things happening. Like they were and they weren't, right? At least in like where I grew up in Denver. And I've just really thought to myself, you know, kind of talking about similar to Deborah, how do you deconstruct the Native, right? And how do you deconstruct Curtis, you know, like those photographs? And I always thought the best way to disrupt, I think, people's expectations of being Native is through heavy metal and is through rock, is through something that people don't even imagine us being in these spaces either. But why do we gravitate towards them, especially in the Southwest, especially in the New Mexico, Arizona, kind of Durango, like Utah area? There's a lot of Native metalheads, like, and it will be 100 degrees outside and everyone is wearing all black. It's incredible. Like, I couldn't do it. It's like long sleeve, like, yeah, button jackets, like leather jackets, like just all black. And that was something I was really like drawn to in a lot of ways. So I kind of started this project that kind of sparked from the news. So current events, right? And the reason I titled my project this idea of the ancestors res metal is I photograph with this idea, right? Where people, when they look at Curtis photos now, it's like, this is the photograph of what the ancestors look like, right? So I kind of take that idea and then I put them with heavy metal people of like, well, these can be the future ancestors and the future way of looking at the idea of what the ancestors are being like in those times for the next like future generation to look back fondly of their own like family lineage. So my project started when 2 Native American teams at Colorado State University were stopped on the tour and they were like patted down because a white woman said that she felt like their Black clothes were suspicious. She heard they were from Mexico. They were actually from New Mexico. They were from Santa Fe and they attended the Santa Fe Indian School. And she said they stood out and they were creepy. They made her feel sick and uncomfortable. And it was just because they were 2 teens who dressed up as metalheads. And the thing is, a lot of the folks that were describing them were describing them as brown, as Native, as those things, but they didn't really talk about the metal, right? They didn't talk about the metal t-shirts and the wearing all black and like how that also adds another thing of like how Native people move in this world too. So I pretty much packed up my car. I said, you know what, let me do a 1-week project on Native metalheads. Like that'd be really interesting to talk about during this time. And I just started to put a call out, ask my Navajo friends, Pueblo friends, if they know any metal bands playing. And I came across my first band called Blind Drive and Suspended. This is actually in Denver. So they also came out to Denver to perform. So like I said, kind of taking these portraitures, photographing a scene that most people don't think about Native people looking like and putting them kind of in these nature backdrops just to kind of show and disrupt that image. And also like to find a scene, right? So for me, the thing about the You Don't Belong is kind of like where metal, punk, alternative rock are always in those sentiments of being those alternative kids or being those kids or being like those ones that don't fit into the club. And that's like what I gravitated towards in high school, which is why I love this scene a lot too, is because they share the same sentiments of this notion of like you don't belong, right? And then there's this subculture of Native folks who love metal and rock. And that was something I felt like growing up in Denver and even the Northern Plains. People in the Northern Plains love hip hop. I like hip hop too, but like my allegiance is to alternative rock. So it was also finding like, wow, I wish I knew that this was here when I was in high school, that people really love this scene and that they love guitars, they love hard sounds. And like for the future of my work, so my current PhD is actually on res metal. So I look at how res metal disrupts, I think, these ideas of what Native people, not just of what they are, right, of who they think we are, but also how res metal remaps, I think, our understanding of the reservation and urban spaces, that you can actually bring the res with you, that you can bring your communities with you, and that we actually travel and have these connections to land and place through music in the same ways that we have always had, right? And that's pretty much like kind of where my work is going, but how I can use these photographs to remap, I think, our lived understanding and experiences through this music. And something that I think is interesting, at least like for work, is I'm looking at how this is alien weaponry. So like how international, even like Indigenous folks come to Navajo Nation to even just perform and share music. So how does that look like across like a New Zealand Maori band who sings in their tribal Indigenous language, come to Navajo Nation, which apparently I didn't know, but that was their first show that they were ever invited to in the United States, right? It was Navajo Nation. And I think that's just such a beautiful thing for like Indigenous tribes to invite other international Indigenous tribes, or like quote, quote, like international, right? But just other Indigenous relatives, of making new relatives like within this scene and sharing this music like together. So sometimes, like for me, community spaces aren't just cultural spaces, they're subcultures. And even if it's like other cultures that you find an affinity to, whether that's like even just like cuisine or cooking or music scenes or art scenes or whatever that is, like, you know, there's also subculture scenes like within the States that I think are things that we're also drawn to.
It's so great.
Yeah, there's such a relationship between like Native people and heavy metal music because my husband Chris grew up in Flagstaff, so he grew up with a lot of Navajo and Hopi kids, and yeah, like he's so into, like he grew up with punk rock, prog rock, and heavy metal, and to this day, like he listens, like all he listens to is death metal and black metal bands from like Norway and Sweden, and like he's so into that, and yeah, so you're gonna have to share some of those, share a list of those bands with me so I can pass them along to him.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. Share res metal bands for sure. I'll send you some Instagram things too. But yeah, there's
Sounds
like an affinity to specifically heavy metal in the Southwest. It runs deep and it's really fascinating to see.
Yep.
That's great. We have a few questions in the chat, but I actually wanted to see if you have any questions for each other or anything more you want to say, responding to anything the other person said. No? Okay.
I think we're pretty aligned.
Yeah, I think so. It's great.
Yeah. Well, one question somebody asked is there more that you would like to do to share your experiences with larger groups of people?
I mean, I think art is a really good way, you know, art